Bridge, an original post-apocalyptic story from the Spinosaurus, read by the author. This is a direct follow-up to the very first two audio narrations I did. Please listen to them for context. You can find them in the playlist linked below. It was only early morning, and yet it was already hot and steamy outside. The sun burned brightly just above the tree line. The heat and golden glow of it caused a massive, black-scaled dinosaur to stir from his sleep, and his red eyes slid open as the sunlight shone directly onto his face. Spino lifted his head off the ground and yawned, flashing his large shining fangs and deep maw off briefly before he chomped his jaws closed. He shook his head and stood up. He started walking on all fours for a short moment before he stood up on his back legs and moseyed down the street towards the community's gate. Once the gate was opened for him, he exited the walled-off neighborhood and entered the forest outside of the town. He headed to the same place he always did first thing in the morning, the nearest stream. The stream was deep enough for him to swim in, and it was full of fish to eat. After a short walk through the forest, he reached the stream and waded into the water. He began to lazily drift in the gentle current as he continued to wake up. Life was good, and things were peaceful. Perfect mornings, like this one, were the best time to reflect on the goodness in his life. The peacefulness meant Spino could enjoy lazy mornings, like he did before the apocalypse. Yes, even dinosaurs enjoyed lazy mornings when they weren't caught up in the fast and furious fight for survival in a harsh world. As he continued to contentedly drift along, his claws gently scratching along the bottom of the stream. Occasionally, this would dig up some rocks and stir up the sandy creek bottom, clouding the clear water around him. Spino opened his jaws and took a big drink of water. Though, no fish happened to be swimming close enough to get sucked into. But that was fine. The early morning sun's golden rays shone through the trees and into the cool water, turning it a vibrant gold. Spino was more than content, even though he hadn't caught a fish yet. Simply drifting along for a time, as his sleepy mind cleared, was just fine with him. It was the perfect way to start a day. Hey! Spino was stirred out of his contented daze by the sound, and he turned his gaze to face the source of the voice. Nick's 9-year-old daughter sat on the riverbank, waving. You left without me, she called. I can't help it you were still asleep, Mabel, Spino replied, with a dinosaur version of a smirk, lifting his head out of the water as he spoke. Usually, she was out of the house and waking him up for their morning walk before he was so much as stirring from sleep. It was their usual morning routine, one Spino pretended to be annoyed by, but he loved it, and Mabel knew full well that he did. Spino then got slightly more serious, the smile vanishing from his face. Hey, how'd you get outside of the gates? He asked. She knew leaving alone was not allowed, and he knew that there was no way the guards would have let her go out alone, no matter how stubbornly she argued with them. When I saw you were gone, I found a place that I could sneak out, she admitted, acting like she'd been caught between a rock and a hard place. There's a spot near the back of the community where I can easily climb over the wall. Mabel, Spino firmly stressed. What? I knew you were coming here. It's just a minute or two run. I was careful, she insisted, cutting Spino off before he could lecture her. Spino sighed, frustrated by her carelessness, though he understood why she took the chance. Having been born into such a chaotic world, and being surrounded by prehistoric animals constantly, she didn't understand the threat they presented like people who had to adapt when they'd reappeared did. No matter how often she was told to be careful, she just didn't see why she couldn't go or do whatever she wanted. Spino sighed, abashed by her recklessness, even though he understood why she felt sneaking out was acceptable instead of waiting for him to come back. He wanted to say more, but after a moment, he dropped the subject without saying anything else. He kept the immediate area around the community clear of most dangerous animals, but he could only do so much. Rogues always slipped into his territory. But instead of lecturing Mabel about both breaking the rules and her carelessness, which would have been a waste of time, and because no harm had been done, he instead asked in a playful tone, "Are you coming in, or are you just going to sit there and watch me swim?" Having her closer to him where he could better protect her would make him feel better about the situation. "Sure, just don't mistake me for a fish again like you did the last time," Mabel giggled, jumping into the water from a large rock, surfacing after a moment. "Hey, I can't help it you swam that close. And sometimes it's hard to tell when something is underwater." "There's a lot of big fish around here, kiddo," Spino replied with a gentle but playful chuckle. Mabel paddled over and grabbed onto his nose. "Sure it is. You just like to goad me, don't you?" she said with playful accusation. "Mabel Edwards, I never! Isn't having fun at your siblings' expense what big brothers are supposed to do?" Spino asked. "Yeah, but they don't usually nearly eat their siblings. Again, you swim close enough, I had to have a little fun. And don't pretend that you didn't think it was hilarious afterwards. And don't say I nearly ate you. You weren't even inside my mouth or even close to it," Spino replied. "I'm a dinosaur. What do you expect my sense of humor to be, anyway?" As he said it, he couldn't help but wonder if Mabel didn't sometimes forget he was actually a dinosaur since she was around him so much, just like how she often forgot how dangerous the world in which she was growing up what truly was. She had known no other life from the day that she was born, after all. "Especially when all of my family members are bite sized," Spino continued. "And besides, all I really did was splash you, and you know it." "Sure," Mabel replied with another laugh as she wiped some water off her face and brushed her hair to the side to get it out of her eyes. "You tell yourself that, big guy." Spino simply shook his head as Mabel climbed up and sat across his snout, her limbs still dangling in the water. Life was most definitely good, and she only made it better. A posse of 4 horses rode down the empty highway at a full gallop, their riders clinging tightly to stay on and not be thrown off. The tumultuous movement of the horses' legs left a swirling mass of leaves and pine needles stirred up in its wake. The riders were in a hurry after hearing a report from one of their scouts about a serious situation they would meet on the road a short distance ahead of them. It was a situation that involved an important bridge being used for travel between the distant communities. The riders rode straight past an allosaurus that bellowed warningly at them from the side of the road. Once they passed, it huffed and carried its breakfast, a white-tailed deer, off the road and into the forest to eat without further disruption. Once upon a time, such animals would have stopped the riders dead in their tracks. However, these riders had seen such animals so many times since civilization collapsed, almost 11 years ago, that they barely gave the dinosaur so much as a glance. As soon as the posse's destination was visible ahead, and the 4 riders slowed their horses to a quick trot, they came to a complete stop once they arrived at the scene. "I told you it was bad," one of the riders said. "You didn't say it was this bad," Nick replied, climbing off his horse and walking to the end of the bridge. He was careful not to step onto it just in case his weight would be enough to send the rest of it crashing into the river below. He turned to the scout who had reported it as destroyed. "Half the bridge is gone, Steve. That's more than bad. This could be catastrophic." "I didn't do an in-depth inspection. I was looking through my binoculars on the way here during my patrol," his eyes gazing from Nick to the bridge. "And I went to report it, per protocol," Steve replied. The bridge in question was an old iron one that spanned a small river. The water level was up dramatically, and the fast-flowing floodwaters caused by a storm to the north had finally beaten the near-century-old structure too much, and half the bridge had fully collapsed into the river. Large sections of the bridge that had fallen had been swept away by the rushing torrent. "It doesn't matter," Nick sighed, waving Steve off. "We have enough wood stored at that old sawmill that we should be able to fix it, though it'll take nearly all that we have cut." We'll have to cut more after if we want to have enough wood for winter. He looked at the other two riders from the community. Go ahead and ride back. I want plans to fix this drawn up by the end of the morning. And make sure Donald knows that all the communities use this trade route. We need to get it fixed. He continued, walking back to his horse and climbing into the saddle. Make a sign to post that clearly explains the road is closed just in case anyone tries to move through this route. And watch yourselves. It's dangerous out there, he added, as the other two turned and rode back the way the group had come from. Two men paused, just long enough for one of them to take a picture of the scene with an old Polaroid camera. They turned and rode off, vanishing up the road after a matter of seconds. Once Nick was on his horse, he turned and faced Steve. These summer storms aren't going to let up. Let's check the bridge on the secondary route and make sure it's not out too. If it is, then we have an even bigger problem on our hands. With that, Nick and Steve turned their horses and rode back down the road. But instead of turning in the direction of the community at the first intersection they came to, they turned to the left and headed towards the secondary route further downstream. As they rode, Nick noted that the woods around them seemed still, and the only sounds other than the horses were the singing insects. If the forest was this silent, it meant that something dangerous was around, and you had to keep your wits about you. Well, at least we haven't seen any dinosaurs, Steve called. Well, other than the one that was stuffing its gut. Don't ever say that. One will show up at the worst time if you do. And don't let your guard down, Nick reprimanded. Haven't you noticed how silent the woods around here are? They moved on without speaking again. And as they neared the second bridge, Nick suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. Softly, he said, "Whoa, whoa." He turned to face Steve, who also stopped his horse and pointed down at the road. Nick whispered, "There's fresh Dimetrodon tracks crossing the road here, and they're heading towards the bridge. You see the mud they trailed? Let's leave the horses here and go on foot. It'll be quieter, and the bridge is only about a mile ahead." Dimetrodon was a large, four-legged carnivore with a sail that ran along its spine. It was a Permian-era genus of non-mammalian synapsid, with large teeth that were diversely shaped and positioned, which gave the animal a wicked bite from which very few survived. Dimetrodons also had a long tail, and despite looking like a dinosaur, it was more of a distant relative to humans instead. They also tended to be just about as reasonable as most humans were. Not at all. Like a bear, they were fast enough to catch a running person in a few strides, and were very dangerous to meet if they were in groups. The fresh tracks left on the road seemed to indicate a rather large group was lurking within the surrounding forest. Leaving the horses loosely tied to a tree so they could pull free if threatened, and taking a rifle each, Nick and Steve followed the tracks in the road. Creeping along quietly, they kept their eyes on the surrounding forest in case other Dimetrodon happened to be around. It wasn't uncommon to find multiple groups in the same area. In fact, Nick liked to say that if there was one group of them around, there was likely two more in the immediate area. As Nick and Steve walked along, the forest stayed quiet. Suddenly, the sound of birds fluttering away in fright caused both men to aim their weapons in the direction of the noise. They had nearly walked the full mile, and the bridge was visible just ahead. This bridge was a much newer one than the iron one, and it should have been able to withstand the abuse from the rushing floodwaters. Nick hoped that meant it had survived the overnight torrent. After hesitating for a moment and seeing nothing, Nick and Steve nodded to one another and then continued moving slowly forward. They kept their guns raised and ready to fire. When they reached a position where the bridge was fully visible, they both stopped. "It's intact," Steve whispered. "Yeah, and the tracks go off the road just ahead. Dimetrodon were likely heading to the river, but let's not stick around. I don't fancy becoming an early lunch for the alpha predator of the Permian era," Nick whispered back. They both quietly, but quickly retreated to the grazing horses, which were still where they'd been left. As Nick climbed onto his horse, he noticed that the forest continued to be unnervingly silent, and he wondered if it was something other than the prehistoric carnivores that had caused the animals to go silent. Even the insects had stopped singing. After pausing long enough to take a mental note of the silence, he and Steve started riding back towards the community. Well, Nick asked Donald, the community's head of construction projects. Well, I looked over the pictures of the damage and drew these up, Donald replied, laying out a sheet of paper for Nick to see. We have enough wood to fix the bridge, no problem, but if the water keeps flowing as hard as it has been, it will fall apart again in a few weeks, because we're going to have to build off the same foundation that gave way. We should wait until the water goes down, and then maybe we can figure out a workaround. Donald, there's three things about waiting that you didn't take into consideration. That's the main trade route between the four communities. And it's the quickest route to Arnold's community. And it's also the only road still in decent shape. You take a wagon down the secondary route, and at the very least, you'll lose a wheel. If you're lucky, it'll only be just the one. Then you know what happens? You get robbed by some roaming bandits, or you become lunch for some Desplatosaurus, or heaven forbid, Tyrannosaurus that happens along. You want that to happen? Because it will if someone tries to move down the secondary route. That road is too far gone to fix, so the old bridge is the only choice. Besides, the summer storms aren't going to stop. So we must work with the best road option, because that's the hand we've been dealt. Donald sighed. I'll talk to Aaron about it. He was the risk analyst in the old world, not me. You know that I just drew up the plans on the computer for my father's company. I do it on paper. I'll let you know what he says. With that, Donald took the plans he had drawn up and left the table. He'd been fully honest with Nick. He was brilliant with planning construction with limited resource, but useless when it came to assessing risk and calculating it. He had tried to learn the skill, but he struggled with it. Even before the apocalypse, his job had never involved calculating risks. He had been the one who had done the construction plans at his father's self-owned company, A. Levinson's Construction Company, because his father, Andrew, had known his son never to make mistakes with any type of construction planning, an ability supposedly passed down from Donald's grandfather. Someone else in the company always did the risk calculations. When Nick met Donald while out on a supply run with Spino, he had picked up what skills Donald had almost right away. Donald, deviously skilled with using only a few resources, had built several traps around his shelter, and, like Donald's father, Nick had never known him to make a single error. Donald had been key in reinforcing the original steel-plated walls that surrounded the community by adding more metal in areas and other reinforcement materials, including some concrete the community had scavenged. He had many strengths, but the skills needed for risk assessment remained elusive to him. Nick held his meeting with Donald in the old shelter house in the center of the community. The shelter housed several tables in a large section of the community that served as a recreation area for those in the town. Nick sighed, walked outside, and stood in the street. He muttered to himself, why do I try to get straight answers from people? Maybe I should partner with the guy who can help make sure the plans work correctly, instead of wasting my time. For all his construction smarts, Donald often spoke in circles unless he had the actual answer you wanted, and that usually didn't happen right away. It seemed he always avoided getting to the root of the issue. Nick usually had to encourage Donald to go to whoever knew how to resolve the problem at hand and adjust his plans accordingly. It was frustrating at times, but Donald would come through in the end. He always had. That didn't make the process of getting the answer any less frustrating at times. Nick? Nick smiled at the sound of the voice, his worries instantly draining away for a moment, and turned to face his wife. Good morning. Sorry for taking off before coffee was even done. Something unfortunate came up. Susan smiled understandingly. It's okay. When you fall in love with the community leader, you have to get used to spending time alone. She wrapped her arms around her husband's neck. You're always home in the evenings, so that makes up for it, she added, as Nick returned the hug with a satisfied sigh. So, what was the problem? she asked. Nick sniffed her hair and answered. Is. What is the problem, you mean? It's ongoing at the moment. He stepped back. I'll tell you, but I want to show you something first. Something to brighten the day and apologize for running off. Running off again? Susan clarified. Nick nodded. Yeah, again, he chuckled. Though it was frowned upon, they went outside of the community without an escort, and Nick took Susan to a nearby field at the top of a hill. He used to sit there with Spino back in the early days after the community gained some stability. It was the same place he used to sit, overlooking the town, as he filled out his journal. His journal was now used by the community as an educational record of the early months of the apocalypse, one of several records that had been compiled into a historic omnibus about the community's development, people, and events. Should we be out here? Susan asked. It's okay, Nick assured her. Spino keeps this area clear of other dinosaurs. It's his territory, after all. They stopped at the top of the hill, which had a thick layer of tall grass growing across it. I discovered this little trick by accident, but it's a very cool sight to see. But you have to come in the morning, Nick said, taking Susan's hand and pulling her close to his side. He then pulled out a silver pistol with blue patterns on its side from his holster. He'd found it on a supply run early in the apocalypse and had kept it as his own weapon. Firing it into the air once, the grass around them exploded with fluttering blue feathers and large birds that took to the sky in a choir of panicked calls. Susan gasped, watching open mouthed as the birds flew in tight formations in various loops for a few moments before taking to the sky. As they flew upward, they vanished into the blue, their feathers making it seem like they dissolved into the sky. Nick leaned against her, an action she returned, and chuckled, watching the sky with a smile. The display the birds put on was as stunning as the first time he'd watched it, and he never grew tired of it. What are they? Susan asked. I don't know. Some species of prehistoric bird. I know they aren't from the modern age, Nick replied, sliding the pistol back into its holster. They stood on the hill and quietly watched the sky, enjoying a quiet moment spent together after a tumultuous morning. The bridge is out. That's the problem, Nick explained once he and Susan had returned to the community. On the main route? Yeah, I want to get it fixed within the week. The secondary route is secondary for a reason. It's become nearly unpassable. Honestly, we should investigate cleaning some of the other roads and closing the current secondary route for good, Nick replied, stopping at the base of the wall just inside the gate. I'm waiting on Donald and Aaron to give me some news on when we can start with repairs. Until that's done, we're between a rock and a hard place. The flooding leaves us no way to reach our friends. Susan nodded. Was Mabel gone when you left? She asked. No, but Spino was awake, Nick replied. Susan sighed. Well, she was gone when I went up to her room. She wasn't anywhere in the house, and I didn't see her outside. Nick wasn't really surprised. She probably went with Spino and we didn't notice. She goes out with him every morning. She probably just caught up with him on his way out, and we both just missed her. Don't worry. You know he won't let anything happen to her. Susan nodded, agreeing that Mabel was most likely with Spino. Nick was probably right. Perhaps they both happened to just miss seeing her. She was about to reply when her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. Hey, Nick! Aaron shouted from across the street. I have some good news for you. After running some numbers, looking at potential scenarios, going over available resources, and considering the expected weather for the coming weeks, Aaron had decided that they could begin making repairs on the destroyed bridge while the waters were still high. He had come up with a plan that, if everyone followed a few requirements he had written down, would allow them to begin building even with the floodwaters still high. Repairs on the bridge started the next day. The community used a set of large wagons that were hauled by either a set of 4 horses or 2 massive harnessed triceratops. The horses were used to pull the lighter loads in wagons, and the tamed triceratops were used to pull the heavier loads. Despite the heat, the community made good progress on the repairs. Everyone who could was taking part to make the work go faster. Soon, they had the structure constructed and were adding wooden planks that covered the floor of the bridge. Nick helped Steve slide a freshly cut plank into an empty spot, and they began to nail it in place. Have you and Susan decided on whether or not you're going to have any more kids? Steve asked as he hammered one of his nails into the plank. Nick looked up at him and chuckled. Mabel's about all we can handle. She's going to worry her mother to death without the help of a new partner in crime. Yesterday morning, Susan thought Mabel snuck out, but Spino swore to me that she was with him the whole time. I think we both just happened to miss her leaving the house. Steve laughed at the reply, as Nick added, but Susan insists, and this is hush hush now, but we're waiting to see if her next monthly cycle comes as usual. The news was so unexpected that Steve let the hammer slip and almost smashed his finger. But most men were wearing gloves made from a leather like material, a mix of lithorax and cave lion hide. And the material offered enough protection that the hammer blow didn't hurt when it landed. Steve didn't even notice it, in fact. He just chuckled. Congratulations might soon be in order then. What about you? You're not too old, Nick replied. Steve sighed and finished hammering the nail into place. No, he shook his head. What happened with my family back at the start? No. I'm never going to be a father again. Hey, it's been over a decade, Nick said, standing up. Don't beat yourself up over it forever. It's my fault they died. I wasn't there. If you'd been there, you'd be dead too, Nick replied. But maybe they would have survived, Steve countered with a slight shake of his head. You can't assume that to be true, Nick insisted. After a few seconds, Steve sighed and looked away. Did our boys give you an idea for how long repairs on this thing will take? Deciding to change the subject, Nick nodded. If we keep this pace up, no longer than a week at the most. That's faster than expected, which is good. I want to beat the next storm. Well, that could be any day. Exactly, Nick replied, grabbing another nail. One of the workers helping with the bridge was standing alongside the tree line away from the main group. He was cutting some boards into small pieces. He suddenly paused and looked toward the trees. He could have sworn he heard a faint whisper coming from somewhere within, like a breeze whispering through the leaves. It sounded like the words, "New time." The worker didn't see anything or anyone, so he moved a little closer to the dense foliage. A few seconds later, the leaves exploded outward as a group of 3 Coelophysis darted out. One, presumably a male due to its more vivid and colorful patterns, was carrying a dead leptictidium in its mouth. The 3 dinosaurs ran past the worker and down the bank toward the edge of the river. The worker sighed, assuming the strange voice was just the 3 dinosaurs making an odd sound that happened to sound like human words. He went back to sawing the board and gave the matter no further thought. Mabel and Spino were once again swimming in their creek. This time, they were playing a game of tag at Mabel's insistence. She was convinced that she could outswim Spino, and while he was more than happy to entertain his sister, he was not about to let her believe wild ideas such as that. Come back, my little fish, Spino called, deepening his voice. He'd given her a head start, but was rapidly closing the distance. Mabel stopped swimming and turned to face him. I'm not a fish! You swim like one. Well, you won't catch me like you do a real fish, Mabel giggled, and dove under the water, swimming as fast as she could. Spino rolled his eyes, snorted in an amused way, and then followed, using his powerful legs and strong tail to speed up his movement through the water. He began to close the distance even faster than before, and by the time Mabel came back up for air, Spino was able to reach out and poke her with his finger. Tag, he said. Dang it! Mabel complained, splashing water in the dinosaur's direction. How'd you catch me? She asked. I'm a fast swimmer, Spino replied, chuckling as he spoke, the water from the splash running down and dripping off his scaly nose. I guess so, Mabel grumbled. Spino nudged his nose against her. Oh, don't be like that. My hand is still bigger than you, so of course I'm faster. Hey, you want to see just how fast I can swim? Mabel looked up at him. Water dripped from her hair, and she smiled. Sure! Relieved that she wasn't still pouting, Spino smiled. Climb on then, he said, motioning to the back of his neck with his head. Mabel swam over, climbed on, and once she was ready, Spino turned with a large splash of water and swam back down the stream in the opposite direction. After passing a few forks and taking a few turns, Mabel saw that he had swum into a large lake. She imagined what it had looked like years before, when there would have been boats zooming around on the water and people swimming at the beaches. Then, her imaginings went back to millions of years ago, when there would have been giant fish, and massive marine reptiles, and semi aquatic carnivores, and herbivorous dinosaurs swimming around in lakes like this one. Ready? Spino asked. Yeah, Mabel replied. Hang on and take a breath. I'm diving, Spino said, tensing and then rearing up before diving down into the water. Mabel took a deep breath as he dove under, and she clung on tightly. Mabel took a deep breath as he dove under, and she clung on tightly. Under the surface of the lake, the sunlight appeared golden, and the water was murky brown, mixed with green. Spino propelled himself through the water and moved faster than Mabel thought possible. He spun gracefully around submerged logs and even arched beautifully over the wreck of a sunken pontoon boat. Spino's red eyes scanned the dim water, and he snapped at a large catfish as it glided past. Spino's black scales blended in perfectly with the underwater environment. His entire body, from head to the tip of his tail, was covered in black scales. Even his claws were the same color. The color made him blend into his watery environment and seemingly disappear while beneath the surface. His eyes, teeth, were the only parts of his body that deviated in color. Mabel felt a great thrill at the speed Spino was swimming, and, though the images were blurry, she was amazed by what she could see in the water. She soon felt the need for air and patted Spino on the neck a few times to let him know. Spino took the message and began swimming upward toward the golden light of the surface. Mabel burst out into a fit of laughter as Spino shot out of the water with a dramatic roar before they both crashed back into the lake with a massive splash. How are we doing with the wood? Nick asked, wiping sweat off his face. Donald checked some of the notes he'd taken during the day's construction and, after flipping through them, nodded approvingly. Using just as much as I'd hoped, no accidents at all. We'll need more soon, but another shipment is on its way from the old sawmill. Nick nodded. Good. You know, we should really try to get that place fixed up. Save a lot of time not having to cut all the wood ourselves. You have a lot of projects in mind, Nick. I have plans to make this world a good place to live in. The next generation is going to have to grow up in it, and we might as well make it as good a world for them as we possibly can, Nick chuckled. Donald laughed too. I'll run the idea by Dusty and Aaron, see what they think and get back to you. I didn't realize that Aaron had taken on an apprentice, Nick said. Oh yeah, Dusty is already on the road to outshining him, so I figure getting two opinions is better than one. Numbers don't lie, but two people are less likely to make the same mistake. Anyway, even if your sawmill project is considered possible, we have more crucial projects that need to be finished before winter, so fixing that place up probably won't happen till next summer at the soonest, if it happens at all. Hey, it's your job, man. I just keep giving you more to do, Nick said with a small laugh. Donald chuckled again. Yeah, I totally appreciate that too, he said sarcastically. I've probably got enough blueprints for you in my house to fill up one of my hall closets. The walkie-talkies Nick and Donald were both wearing suddenly blared ecstatically, "Hello?" The voice sounded urgent. Donald grabbed his walkie first and asked, "Haley, is that you? Where's that shipment?" "You've got to help me. Two Allosaurus came out of the woods and flipped us over. They got the horses, and I don't know if anyone else is left. I'm hiding under one of the wagons. They're still out there, sniffing around and eating whatever they find." The panic in her voice was obvious, even through the staticky radio. Nick and Donald locked eyes. "Oh shit," Nick said, grabbing his own walkie. Speaking calmly, he said, "We're on our way. You just hang tight. How far down the road are you?" "A quarter of a mile at most," Haley replied softly. "We're on our way," Nick replied, trying to be assuring as he began looking around. "That's close. It'll be quicker to get there on foot than untying, saddling, and getting on the horses," he quickly muttered, then shouted, "Everyone! Grab the weapon you brought with you! A few of you stay here to guard the horses. The rest of you come with me!" Nick ran to a tent that had been pitched in case someone needed to get out of the sun and grabbed a rifle sitting on a crate. Once he made sure it was loaded, he ran down the road, a large crowd following him. Once he was satisfied with his swim, Spino clambered out of the lake and shook himself off and, accidentally, knocked Mabel off into the shallow water. "Hey!" she shouted as she sat up. "I guess you should have hung on," Spino chuckled as he sauntered onto shore. There were lots of fossils mixed in with the rocks on the shore, and Mabel began examining them as Spino lay down on his stomach. He watched her for a short time and turned his sail to face the sun. Mabel found a large fossil that was likely once from some Carboniferous era plant or coral. She picked it up gently, and as she turned to show it to Spino, her eyes widened. "Spino?" she spoke. Spino raised his head and looked in the direction her eyes were focused, and he spotted an Allosaurus. The gray and silver-colored dinosaur was strolling onto the shore. The red crests on top of its head were angled in such a way that it made its eyes look as if they had an evil glare. Spino stood as Mabel backed up towards him. He strolled forward a few paces and planted one of his legs on either side of his sister protectively. The Allosaurus noticed and looked at Mabel and then glanced at Spino. Every time it glanced at Mabel, it looked like it had just seen the most delicious-looking snack on the planet, but it made no move towards her. It would make no move to come closer with the large Spinosaurus standing above her. It snarled, but seemed to lose interest. Instead, it walked to the water's edge, took a drink, and then left. It disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only its tail visible in the trees for an additional moment before it, too, vanished. Once the Allosaurus was gone, Spino looked down at Mabel. "Sneaking out of the community on your own to follow me yesterday was a stupid thing to do," he said. "I really should have said it then, but decided not to bring it up since it was a one-time event, and because I didn't think you would listen to me. But I think you get why now, though. What if you'd run into that thing while out on your own?" he asked. Mabel shivered. "I'd be dino food," she muttered, the reality of her reckless actions sinking in. "Yeah. So, I won't tell your father about yesterday morning, but don't do it again. Not even if I'm gone when you wake up," he said. "I think you sometimes forget how dangerous it is outside of the walls. I think I forget too, because there's nothing out here that can really threaten me." Mabel nodded and looked down at the sand. She understood that sometimes she didn't appreciate just how dangerous the world could be. Spino relaxed, stepped back, and lay down again by Mabel's side. "That is a very nice fossil you found," he said. She smiled brightly and leaned against his snout. "It is nice. It's going in my room, right on the table next to my window." "Do you know what it is?" Spino asked, nudging her. Mabel giggled and examined her find. I think it's coral, or maybe..." She paused and looked at it from another angle, and continued. Oh, maybe it's a sea scorpion. The exposed bits look like an arthropod. Maybe. That would mean this came from an uh, Ordovician era ocean instead of some carboniferous jungle or bay or something. She felt giddy at the possibility of such a discovery. She'd read about such animals in some of her books on prehistory and dinosaurs, and she had always wanted to find a fossil of a sea scorpion since she first read about them. Seeing the excitement build back up in his little sister made Spino chuckle softly. Mabel got just as excited about the original prehistoric animals as she did about the revived ones, and Spino found it simply adorable. Haley stayed hidden under the upside-down wagon, closing her eyes tightly as the snarling, sniffing dinosaurs outside began to nudge the wagon around. She scooted as far from either side as she could when one stuck its tongue under the wagon, flinging saliva onto her head and arms. She closed her eyes again and held her knife and radio close. Suddenly, the wagon flipped back over and crashed onto the road a few meters away. Haley's eyes shot open as she made eye contact with the dinosaur standing above her. She could feel the other one's breath on the back of her neck on the opposite side. The male Allosaurus was colored black, with a blue streak running down its spine, and its belly was yellow. The female, on the other hand, was a light tan in color on its belly, and green covered most of her body, and her head crests were red. They snarled and lowered their heads to the ground to feed on their prey. Haley screamed and closed her eyes for the third time as the two open maws descended toward her. There was a gunshot, and the female started shaking her head and roaring in pain as blood dripped from where her eye should have been. Haley opened her eyes again and noticed the male was looking around for the threat. Nick lowered his rifle as a crowd of people came up behind him. "Nice shot," Steve complimented. The two Allosaurus hissed and began stalking towards the new threat. "Line up, one row behind the other one, and get ready to fire," Nick ordered. "Oh, Civil War style. You finally taken some lessons from history books?" Steve chuckled as he took a position at Nick's side. Nick glanced at Steve in mild annoyance. It was no time for joking, and he didn't respond to the inappropriate quip. His friend enjoyed reading about events like the Civil War every chance he could, and often encouraged Nick to do the same as well. Steve believed that learning about certain styles of living and combat could perhaps be adapted for their new world. It was perhaps a practical idea, but Nick never had time to read. His current combat style was simply a coincidence. "Aim high. Aim for their heads. We don't want to hit Haley on accident," Nick cautioned as he also took aim again. "Haley, get into the wagon!" someone from Nick's right shouted, but the girl seemed frozen where she lay. The female Allosaurus continued to stalk towards the line of people, but the male dinosaur seemed to pause and hang back. Because of this, when the order to fire was given, most people chose the nearest dinosaur as their target. It was pelted by a furious volley of fire. It roared and shook its head again as it was hit over and over, and then it charged, roaring louder and angrier. "Again!" Nick shouted. Suddenly, he changed his mind. "Forget that! Scatter to both sides of the road! Confuse her! Then bring her down with a second wave of bullets! Target her head, especially her neck!" No one noticed that the male Allosaurus had turned its attention back to Haley. As it lunged for her, she screamed and flattened herself on the road. The jaws opened wide above her, and she swung her arm upward in an arch, burying the knife in the roof of the dinosaur's mouth. The Allosaurus shrieked and shook its head over and over. The knife flew out of its jaws and into the forest. It then turned and glared at the girl on the ground, and slammed a claw-adorned foot down on her legs. Haley screamed as her legs were crushed under the dinosaur's foot. Meanwhile, the female Allosaurus was hit in the head by a second wave of gunfire from all sides. The damage to her neck proved to be too much, and she collapsed to the ground, bleeding heavily and spasming slightly. Moments later, she lay dead on the road. Everyone turned back to the male dinosaur, just in time to see it grab Haley by her shoulders in its jaws. It shook her violently, until her scream stopped, and then it stalked off into the forest, vanishing into the trees with its prize. It happened so fast that the dinosaur had disappeared before anyone thought to raise their guns. Nick sighed after a moment. "Damn it, shit!" he said. Then he shouted and kicked a nearby bucket, which had likely been thrown from the wagon, off into the trees. "Someone go back to the bridge, get a horse, take it back to the community, and tell her brother, and figure out who else was in those wagons and tell their families too," Nick ordered solemnly, as he began to walk back towards the bridge, knowing there was nothing else to be done. Such tragedies were unavoidable in the New World. Still, every time they happened, they always hit hard. Bridge, an original post-apocalyptic story from the Spinosaurus. I hope you enjoyed. This was the introduction, I would call it, to the main setting of my book. The first two narrations I did are set 11 years before the main plot. This is generally where the main plot picks up. Specifically, it really starts going in chapter 2, but there was a little tease for what's to come in this narration. If you picked up on it, cool. If you want to check out some of the other narrations in this continuity, I have a playlist linked below that will have the complete narration set I've done. This should be narration number 5 that I've done, and I'm planning to do one more that will follow after the one that is titled A Survivor's Daily Routine. That will be a bit of an introduction to that little side story, which is set within the same continuity, but is actually set 10 years after this particular storyline. But as it's a standalone story set on the side without the main characters, I don't really think there's an issue sharing some about it now. So anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and please, if you're curious on checking out the full story, feel free to either stick around or just check back in a few months. I'm hoping to have the first book released by the end of the year. I really am. So, very hopeful for that, and I will keep providing updates as closer to publication. Well, let me rephrase that sorry, tongue twisted myself, as publication draws nearer. So anyway, yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video, or the next narration, or whatever you end up watching next.